I think, at least for me, the feelings of burnout and overwhelm come from unrealistic expectations, A, that you put on yourself, and B, that you project on others putting on you. So I think because of the fact that you and I are very transparent and that we talk through problems.
Welcome, everyone. I am so excited to be here today with an extra special guest, my COO, Jess Spino. And Jess is doing a little What the Fundraising takeover, actually. So I'm going to let her introduce herself, tell you a little bit about her and her background and sort of what brings her to our work together. And then she's in charge, which this is not the only thing that is true for. So I'm going to pass it to her, and then she's going to run this convo. We wanted to give you guys a really extra special look behind the scenes of some of the What the Fundraising topics and what's inside the book, since it just released yesterday. So Jess, take it away.
Mallory, you said takeover. I don't know. That feels kind of personal. Like, are we starting there? Is that what's happening?
Take it over.
I'm pretty good at taking stuff over, apparently. Well, thank you so much for having me. As Mallory mentioned, I am her COO, and we've been together for about a year now, almost exactly, Mallory. So it's been a really exciting ride. And when I came into Mallory's business, she was actually very quickly going to be leaving on maternity leave. And she was also in the middle writing her amazing book, which is coming out with the fundraising. So it was really an interesting journey. And I got to really see a lot of the behind the scenes that was going on, as well as the beautiful words written on the page. So I'm so excited for this book to come into the world, Mallory. And I have lots of questions to ask you because I think they're going to be amazing for the people that might want to read this. So a big piece of sort of what you talk about in What the Fundraising is this concept of, enabling fundraisers. So I'd love to kind of know, like, in your own words, what that looks like and why you feel like that is so important for success in sort of today's complicated fundraising environment with all the things going on. Tell us a little bit more about enabling.
Yeah, so it was interesting picking the subtitle of the book, right, which is Embracing and Enabling the People Behind the Purpose. And I think a lot of people expected me to put empower in there instead of enable. And it was like a very, very conscious decision to choose the word that I did. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that I kind of forgot actually that oftentimes enablement, or when we talk about enabling behavior, we think about that in like a negative sense, right? We're sort of like enabling bad behavior, because I think about enablement, or the place I hear the word enablement the most is when we talk about technology enabling us to take certain actions, or tools and resources that actually make certain actions easier to do and help us get over the action line. And when I think about things like tech enablement, what I envision is the person or the team having all of the core knowledge and skills and information and resources that they need in order to take the action. But the tool comes in and makes that action easier to do, either by adding something or removing something from what gets in the way of taking that action. And so when I think about fundraisers being enabled, actually mostly what I'm thinking about is how we get the stuff out of their way that's holding them back from being able to take authentic action, to be embodied in their work, to be able to connect more deeply with donors. And I didn't choose empowerment because I sort of felt like, who am I to like empower people, right? Like, people have their power. I see it inside of them. They also, in my opinion, have the answers to so many of the questions that they feel like they don't. And so enablement for me is really like, how do we support fundraisers to create the environments that enable success, to create the teams and the communities that enable people to be in their full human selves when they do this work, that enable them to build deep relationships with fundraisers, and then give them tools to decrease resistance that gets in the way of them being able to take those actions. And so the tools and the strategies are not about like throwing a new fundraising plan at everybody, but really giving them tools that focus on helping fundraisers take effective and prioritized actions that lead to the results that they want to see.
Oh my gosh, I love that so much. And I think It's such an interesting thing because I guess a lot of people use the word empowering and it has a positive spin on it. Just like I think sometimes enabling, maybe prior to this conversation, might have a negative spin. But I think what's so interesting is this concept that I never thought of like the centering behind that, right? And that like, who are we to sort of give power to other people? And I think I love how you've really shifted that back to fundraisers sort of, carving out, kind of foraging their own path. So I love that so much. So along those lines, can you share sort of a specific example or a story for our listeners around sort of some time that you really saw this enablement sort of take effect, or what the transformative impact was of this sort of mentality?
Yeah. So, I mean, in the book, I go through a lot of the different coaching techniques that I use to help fundraisers overcome inner blocks to fundraising. And so the book is set up in two parts. The first part of the book is the problem. And I really sort of frame up the like why we have found ourselves as a sector and as individuals in the situation that we're in. And it is not for the nonprofit leader who is fundraising for their organization. It's not about placing the blame on individuals for being responsible for the situation we're in. And we need to really hold this duality that we might not be the reason we are here where we are, and we can take a level of accountability and ownership around how we move out of it. And so I say all that to say, like, coaching sometimes can get a bad rap because it over individualizes problems, right? And it ignores systemic issues. The book doesn't do that. I talk a lot about systemic issues, and I want people to have individual tools to be able to navigate these systemic issues with more capacity, intentionality, resources inside of them. And so that's really where the coaching tools come in. So I'll give a few sort of examples. We spend every nonprofit leader, I don't know if I've ever heard a nonprofit leader say that they have more time than they need, right? Every nonprofit leader is like, I'm doing way too many things. I do not have enough time to do all of these things. But what takes a lot of our time that we might not realize it is rumination, right? When we spiral around a decision, we don't have clarity on the next step forward. We spend a lot of time in that decision-making state where we're stressed and we're anxious and we're ruminating and we're doubting ourselves. And so one of the ways that I enable fundraisers is by decreasing or fully removing the time spent in rumination. So giving people specific coaching tools that help them either downregulate their nervous system, because when we're in fight or flight, that's often what's triggering that rumination, because it's sort of holding us back. It's the anxiety and the fear that we feel inside of ourselves, holding us back from actually taking action by keeping us trapped in that sort of decision-making state. Right. So part of what I do, a lot of people would say, okay, so tell them what to do, give them the strategy. But what that would do is give people clarity one time for one answer, right? That doesn't actually increase their capacity to tap into clarity by themselves. But giving people coaching tools that help them downregulate their nervous system, come back into a more grounded state, be able to ask themselves questions, be able to get curious about answers, to have awareness around external barriers and internal barriers that are getting in their way. What it does is it gives fundraisers the clarity around what they should be prioritizing, what they should be doing, who they should be talking to, how they should be talking to them. And so it allows them to actually really, really, really increase their internal capacity to be able to fundraise effectively. So, for example, when we talk about him in the book and give his whole case study. When he first came into Power Partners, he only had done the executive coaching tools at that point. Like, I didn't even know this at the time, but he hadn't even gone into the strategy section. And just from some of the tools that I just shared with you, he moved his organization from $200,000 to $700,000. Because all of a sudden, what he was able to do was stop spending so much time in the rumination. He was able to make more confident decisions. He was able to recognize when, ooh, that's fear, right? Like, think about how much time that would save to not hear as much of, oh, you shouldn't be doing that because of X, Y, and Z, or that person's mad at you because you haven't heard back from them in 72 hours. And instead, you just had more of a clear head to know kind of like the next action you should be taking, right? You're moving through those things so much faster. Hillary Wolkin, who we also talk about in the book, also talks about this a lot, the impact that this had on her fundraising. And it's really interesting. So she talks about actually how her fundraising started to increase, but her amount of donor outreach actually really decreased because she wasn't just like spray firing, emailing every person under the sun for some money. She was being really clear about alignment, and she was being really in touch with like, what is the purpose of the work that I'm doing, instead of I'm just trying to stay busy because that feels good to my nervous system that's really nervous about this. And so she talks about, I don't know if we talk about this in the book, actually, I think this was in a podcast interview with her, but she talks about how like at first it made some of her, like her boss and her board uncomfortable because they were like, we should be outreaching to more people. And she was like, no, like that's our anxiety, our worry that tells us that. But the truth is that we want to be really just focusing on folks who are aligned. And here's what that looks like. And so that's an example, but being able to hold that line to say, actually, I'm not going to give in and email some random 20 people because I'm in scarcity mindset right now. Being able to hold that line, that's what comes from coaching tools like what's in the book.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's really kind of where we come down to sort of that systemic impact, right? Is not only training the fundraiser, but also training her boss to sort of understand like the strategy and the principles behind it. Because, I think that there's that sort of ripple effect of that, right? I mean, you probably see that often. One other thing that I just wanted to touch on that you said, because I think that's really interesting, is like, how do you, for clients in the program, sort of articulate the difference between what you called rumination, or sort of being like thinking about things, versus sort of rest or time to let creative solutions come? Like, what is that distinction? Because I think, we're in this sort of urgency culture where everything, it's like, do it now, do it now. And then there's this other side of it, which I know you and I talk about all the time, is like time to set boundaries, time to rest, time to like that, like sometimes thinking about it is the work, right? So how do you make that, how do you draw that distinction for your clients?
Yeah. Okay. This is such a good question. I'm so glad you're asking this. So there's a difference between, so there being, chatter or conversation in our head is not necessarily bad by any means. Like to your point, thinking through things, giving ourselves like time and space, their procrastination gets a bad rap, but there's more and more research that sometimes what's happening actually in somebody's brain when they're quote unquote procrastinating is them thinking through things. Right. And so I think it's really important to not like, for me to not make it sound like there's this like sort of good and bad brain. But here's the difference, right? Rumination is stress and fear. And the way you hear that in your head is really binary. So rumination would be like, this is definitely the wrong thing to do. Or if I can't do that, then this. Or what if I don't do this thing exactly right? Or I have to tweak that one more thing in order for blank. Like, and so when you think about rumination, for folks who are listening, like, and I remember this so clearly from when this used to be a much bigger part of my sort of life, was this like bouncing back and forth between these very binary decisions, right? And that I felt sort of trapped ping ponging. Letting things evolve in your head or being creative, that's curiosity, right? That's openness, that's wonder. And so, I get a lot of questions often about like, what's the difference between fear and intuition? And it's really the same thing, right? If you hear in your head, oh, I definitely shouldn't email them today because it's Friday and they won't open an email on Friday. That's fear, right? If you hear in your head, I wonder if I should hold this till Monday because it would have a better chance of being opened. That is curiosity, and that is openness and intuition, right? And so you might be like, but Mallory, it's the same thing, but it's really not. And like where it comes from is incredibly important, even if the action might ultimately be the same, which would be waiting until Monday to send it. It actually is really different. And oftentimes, when it's coming from fear, you're going to find another reason on Monday to not send it to. And so starting to like make sense and have more awareness around those like conversations in our head is a really helpful first step.
Okay, that's awesome. And that's such a good, articulation. And I love how you're sort of like, talking about things not being binary, and so much of what we talk about in the work that you and I do together is like this idea of like things being both right brain and left brain, right? Like it's kind of coming up with the plan, that's the creative piece, and then getting things over the action line, right? Like so developing the steps in that plan. And that's really parallel, I think, in a lot of ways to sort of what you're teaching fundraisers to do. So that's really awesome. So you talked a little bit just now about sort of the stories we tell ourselves, right? But what I'd love to know some more about is how to sort of help people, not the internal story, but the external story. So how do we share the story of our organization, and how do you feel like that connects to this idea of enablement? How does that sort of, to use your word, enable, but empower, right, fundraisers to sort of, tell the story of their organization to help them take more strategic action?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such an interesting question because in the book, I don't really talk about storytelling very much, but I talk about connection and I talk about building connected relationships. And to me, the way we tell our stories, when we're telling our stories in ways that really enable us and inspire other people to take action, we're doing those things in a really connected way. So in the book, I talk about research from Carol Robin in this book, Connect, Build Exceptional Relationships. And we talk about these different pillars of connection. And one of the first pillar that she talks about is really letting ourselves be fully known and creating space for the other person to be fully known, right? So you can be more fully yourself and so can the other person. She talks about a willingness to be vulnerable, being honest with each other, dealing with conflict productively, both being committed to each other's growth and development. And I'm sharing these things, even though you asked about story and enablement, to say that in order to really connect, in order to share a real story, we have to be in touch with ourselves, right? We have to understand our inner story, our inner alignment. And then what we're able to really craft from there is that external story that connects more deeply with people. I use the term connection a lot, and I think it's easy for it to think, when you think about connection, to really only think about it like one to one, right? Like you and I are connected right now. And yes, like deep connection like that is really important in individual donor relationships. But you can create connection one to many. And part of that is by modeling all of the things that I just said. So, how organizations are you letting yourselves be truly known? How are you letting yourselves be vulnerable? How are you letting yourselves share when there's a challenge more honestly and sort of constructively? We talk a lot about donor trust, right, in our sector, but oftentimes we aren't demonstrating the level of trust that we want from them. We're like, we want them to trust us, but we don't trust them to tell them our real story. And so I think this question that you're asking about storytelling is so important because all of these things, story, alignment, all these things can be quote unquote strategy. But what I want people to move into is all of these things being intention, right? So our intention is to find alignment. Our intention is to connect through story, not to just crank out a story that gets some eyeballs on it. And, maybe it's like, what is our intention behind why we're doing these things? And that's what I really hope sort of is inspired throughout the book, especially with the coaching tools integrated in there, because we can only do those things if we are connected to ourselves first.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, the topic around connection is so important. And I want to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about I think the connection between you and I, because I remember a very we'll move this into a little bit of a lighter topic. I remember a very profound moment when we were first working together as you were writing What the Fundraising. And I remember you calling me. I think I might have been at the cabin or something. And I think there was a momentary blip or a freak out about something that had happened. And I told you a story about our relationship. Do you remember what I said? I don't
Oh
know
my
if you
God,
remember.
no, but now I need to know.
Remember we talked about there would be a time down the road when we would look back on this moment, and I used one of my weird analogies, and you were like, somehow that makes sense. So what I said to you is we're going to look back on this when the honeymoon's over and we're not in love with each other anymore, which I don't know if that moment's ever going to happen, but saying we're going to look back and I'm going to say, remember when we had that fight because you bought a $7 ratchet set without asking me, and we had those ugly curtains from Sears, and we're going to look back and we're going to say, oh my God, look at our curtains now. We're going to say, if you want to buy a ratchet set without asking me, that is okay, right? We're going to get through this. It's good. So I just thought that was a funny story that we want to share with our listeners, and how we refer to that sometimes as, this is just an ugly curtains moment. We're going to move through this. So there were a few ugly curtains moments in the book, but all in all, man, it all worked out. And I am so excited for this to get in the hands of our readers, because there are no ugly curtains in this story. It is a beautiful, beautiful piece that is going to really change the lives of everybody that reads it. Anybody who's ever asked for money, this is a book that needs to get into their hand. Is there anything else that you want to share about the book before we adjourn today? What if you were going to tell our readers one thing about the book, what would you want to share?
Well, okay, I'm curious, before we go into that, if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about connection, because I think that point that you brought up about sort of how we've navigated connection, both in terms of like how we set expectations around things, but also how we have navigated moments of challenge, is like a really great example of, for me, I don't do it perfectly. I have plenty of ugly curtains moments. And in the book, I actually share plenty of like past ugly curtain moments. But I feel like the thing that we have been really intentional about actually are those pillars of connection, right? Letting ourselves be more fully ourselves to create space for the other person to be known. We have been vulnerable in sharing the things that, not just the things that aren't easy for us or that we're going through, but we also, one part of vulnerability is like having hard conversations when things don't go as planned, or when you're struggling, like when you care a lot about someone and you don't want to rupture the relationship with them. And so it can be really hard to be vulnerable to say like, this thing didn't work for me, or this did make me worried about X thing, or when you do this, it makes this really hard for me, And so I think like at the end of the day, like it's easy to look at somebody else's journey, whether you're looking at my business or whether you're looking at the book or whether you're looking at Jess and just all of who she is, and be like, okay, like, that's, it goes so well for them because it's all buttoned up and put together and it looks so perfect. And I think what I really want folks to hear is actually what works really well in my business is our prioritization on staying connected, even when things get really hard. And that is something, and in the episode with Carol Robbins, she talks about this too. She talks about how like conflict, it's not just about like productive management of conflict, but that sometimes conflict can really strengthen relationships, like what happens when you lean into those moments and you don't just like get defensive or cower away, or, yes, is it scary? Is it vulnerable? Do you feel so exposed? Like, absolutely, And so I'm curious, like for you, what that part of our process has been like or felt like, or anything you want to share with folks who are listening.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think is it Brene Brown that calls them rumbles? Like when you get in a meeting and it's not like, I hate you and I'm done. It's like, we're having like some little grindy moments where we're sort of talking through a problem. But at the end of the day, we both are like who we are, and who we are is committed to coming together to solve this problem. Right. Like, so I think that's sort of the heart of it. And, I think so much of like the foundation of why that works for us comes down to this feeling of sort of internal, I don't know if confidence is the right word, but like we're so very clear in who we are and what's important to us. And we've been really vulnerable in making that known. So I think we sort of understand the fabric of who the other person is. and who we are as well. So when we can share that in a way that feels authentic and vulnerable, that allows us to sort of see what we're working with and like come together on it. I've said a lot in the past, I've done, sales conversations and things like that. And I always kind of like compare it to sort of taking all the things and like dumping them out on the table and then sort of just picking through and finding the things that are your touch points or the things that sort of make sense. And I feel like in a lot of ways, that's the process of getting to know somebody, right? It's like, get to know somebody, you dump all your stuff, they dump all their stuff, you sort through it all on the table and you say, okay, what are the things that we can match, right? What are the things that are our touch points, our connection points? So I think we've been really good at that because we're both sort of hard on your sleeve, just like sort of straight shooters in a way. And maybe I think you might be a little bit more diplomatic than I am sometimes. I'm like, please, okay, I'm going to say something and it's going to be rough. And you're like, oh dear God, just say it. Like, you're like, I know it's going to be rough, just say it. So I mean, yeah. And it's also like, just understanding somebody's communication style too, is that like, it comes back to intention. How am I saying it versus how it's received? And sometimes I feel the need to like buffer that because I'm like, I know no matter what my intention is, this isn't going to come out right. So I'm going to just forewarn you that it's probably not going to come out right. Right. So just know that my intention is not to be rough or hurt you. I just, and you're like, oh my God, I'm good. Just say it, Shut up. And that's it too. Like, right. Like, I think at the end of the day, we always have sort of our like laughing and our sense of humor to come back to. And you're like, oh my God, like, I know she's going to like do something kind of like goofy and crazy right now. And like, I need that in this moment to like, we need to laugh about it and like break through the seriousness. And we don't take ourselves too seriously. We're very serious about our work. We're very serious about what we want to create and the impact we want to have on the world and on the sector. But personally, like we don't take ourselves too seriously. And that makes for a really great culture and a great, connection and relationship, and I wasn't afraid to say, I love you on a Zoom call first. I know that's a big no in the corporate world. People are like, oh, when you accidentally like say, I love you at the end of a Zoom call, I'm like, and how about like, if we don't end a Zoom call with I love you, I don't want it. Right. Like, that's like people get so embarrassed. I'm like, no, literally. Like if she doesn't say it back, I like literally like call her back. I'm like, wait, why didn't you say it? I said it first. Right? We're so embarrassing. We're so embarrassing.
Oh my God. No, right? I love it. And like, okay, there's something that you said in there though that I think is like so important for people to hear, which that I just sort of want to call out, which you said about like, we know ourselves and we also sort of know what we're bringing to the table to a certain extent. And not that we don't have our own insecurities or things we worry about, but I think, in the book, I talk about assets and asset mapping, this process for nonprofits around really understanding the things of value. And so like, as you're talking, I'm like, these are the types of relationships that I want, fundraisers to have with funders. Maybe not the I love you on a Zoom call, but like, maybe for some. But like, I want them to have these like connected relationships where things can be hard and rumbly without people kind of going into scarcity mindset or feeling like they have to people please and that they can't talk about hard things because this is change work. Like it is going to be messy, right? And like, when you joined my team, like I was like, this is messy, right? Like things, not only am I about to go out on maternity leave, but I have ADHD, I have 40,000 half-baked ideas. Like there is no type of like, order yet to my business, which you have completely changed. But all of that to say, like, I think there is like this piece is really important around knowing what we bring to the table because it allows for for us to lean in these moments and not feel like, oh, this is the only thing of value, so I have to make it work. It's like, hey, yes, this has come up, but like we're both standing in who we are. We both know the elements we're bringing to the table. I think that allows us to then talk about things that didn't work or shortcomings without it being like, oh, I'm bad at this, right? It's like, okay, like when you did this, it kind of set off this cascade and the you did this is at me, Mallory. When Mallory, you did this, it set off this cascade thing. And so, but I think like, it's interesting. I just feel like for so long in my life, I thought that confidence like was about perfectionism, right? I was like, oh, I'll like be more confident like when I lose this weight, or I'll be more confident when this thing happens, or I'll be more confident when, and like I look at myself now and I'm like, okay, I like all of those things are quote unquote, less ideal by maybe societal standards than those moments in my life where I was like, oh, I'll be confident when. But like now I know who I am, and I'm confident in who that is, all of my faults included. And I just feel like that is a level that allows for a level of connection that's really special and important.
So much. And I think that's kind of like the difference between like your childhood friendships and your adult friendships is like one fight, one argument doesn't like break you in adulthood. Where like when you were younger, it was like, okay, moving on to a new circle of friends now because nobody wants to say they're sorry or like nobody wants to admit they were wrong because you don't have the confidence and the self-awareness to sort of do that, right? I think we have a nice adult relationship, Mallory. We do. We do. We
Okay.
thrived.
I think we do too. Can I ask you a question? I know this is your takeover, but I just thought of something as we were talking. Can I ask you one more question?
Sure.
Okay. So in the book, I talk about this decline. I just cannot help myself, you guys. I just if I could do what the fundraising interviews all day, every day, that's probably what I would do. I just am so curious about
And I love
other
to talk,
people.
so it's perfect.
But okay, so in the book, I talk about this sort of decline from like discomfort to burnout and these elements that lead to chronic stress and burnout. And the five that I talk about in the book are really particular to fundraisers, but they actually apply to our business as well, right? Which are rejection, isolation, power dynamics, pressure, and uncertainty, right? Not all of them apply to our business, but a lot of them do. And what I was thinking recently about how like we work really hard and like especially like up to this book launch and with some other things we have cooking, like you and I have been working a lot. And I think if people saw like the hours in which we were messaging each other or like some of those things, they would be like, oh, like you guys like be careful, you don't want to burn out. And you can tell me publicly right now if I'm way off here, but I don't feel like either of us are heading for chronic stress or burnout at all. And I think I'm not suggesting in any way that people should overwork at all. But I think that we put a lot of the problem on overwork. We're like, you burn out because of overwork, right? You're stressed because of overwork. And what I have really found both in my research and also in my life is that actually it's these other components that are leading to chronic stress and burnout. And so I'm just curious, like, yeah, your sort of take on that and what you think.
Oh my gosh, 100%. And I think a lot of that comes from, and I'm going to call myself a recovering codependent. Still a work in progress, just due to like a whole bunch of factors, which we don't nearly have enough time for. But I think, at least for me, the feelings of burnout and overwhelm come from unrealistic expectations, A, that you put on yourself, and B, that you project on others putting on you. So I think because of the fact that you and I are very transparent and that we talk through problems and that we're very forthcoming about sort of like what our day looks like and like, oh my God, I'm in the car with the kids, or like, okay, like, I've been online for a couple hours already this morning because of the time zone thing. And like, then I'm going to have to take a break in the afternoon to do this, that, and the other thing. And then I'll be back online later tonight. And you're like, whatever, like, I don't care, like as long as it gets done, like, I don't care. So I think, that's one of those things that, again, that comes from connection, communication, understanding how the other person works, and me knowing that that I'm doing what I need to be doing, and not feeling like she expects me to do this and like I'm disappointing her somewhere, I'm not doing enough. It's these thoughts of not enoughness, I feel like, that burn us out. So it's not work or the amount of work you have. Because I know both of us have pretty long, unfinished to-do lists right about at this moment when we're having this fun conversation. I'm like, oh, when we get off this call, it's on. But I think it's not about the size of your list, right? It's about the way you feel about your list, about how fast you feel like you need to get the list done, right? And for me, unfortunately, like the way I work, I'm very right brain and left brain. So I need to sort of be in the right zone to do the things on my list. So some things might sit there longer than others because I'm feeling very creative that day and not strategic. But then the next day I might wake up and feel, oh my gosh, like super strategic, and be able to jump in and like hammer out a huge funnel build because in that day I feel very funnily, not a word, but I feel very, I can picture it, I can see it. So I think it's that acknowledgement of like finding your own style and finding your own flow and knowing that you're not somewhere letting someone down. It is what for me has like prevented me from feeling burned out at all. And also, of course, this is obvious, but like doing the work we love, having fun with it, like that is, I think we've talked before about, and I know this is not something that like something that I love is like the whole gems index. Like I am an emerald sapphire, which means I'm ruled by like order and organization. That's my primary. My secondary is fun. So that is really, really important to me to feel like it's light and it's fun. And like there's like this energy around it that sort of takes on a life of its own for me to feel like I'm doing work that matters and work that I want to continue doing and don't get burned out by. That is a core element for me. So I need to be able to like laugh with you and feel like we have like our little jokes and our little stories that like get us through those hard times, the ugly curtain.
Yes. And laughter regulates our nervous system,
Yep.
right? So it's like, I mean, people have said that about me before. They're like, wow, you go deep really fast. And then you just start cackling. And I'm like, yeah, I think it's like part of how I like handle that, handle the depth of connection that I want with people is to like bring humor in. And then that is like a way to help like kind of deal with the vulnerability together in a way that feels good and keeps you connected and all of those things. Okay, I'm so grateful for your willingness to share. Part of me doesn't want to ask you another question because then people are learning more about you and they're going to try and take you away from me. But no, I'm kidding. But, we wanted to like have this conversation also because like you absolutely are like enable me. And I think I want to say that out loud because not just to give like credit where credit's due, but also for that, but also because I think sometimes maybe to like bring this conversation full circle, sometimes maybe people are afraid of the word enablement because they feel like they should be able to do whatever it is on their own, right? So whether it is, I should be able to take care of all these things off my list, or I should be able to know what decision to make without those tools. And we are shoulding all over ourselves in ways that are completely holding us back. And so I want to say, not only do we need people and tools and all of those things that help enable us, but also our brains and our bodies are set up for an ancient way of living that is not in the modern day. And so your little lizard brain or your big lizard brain or whatever, like does not know how to tell the difference between a lion is going to eat you in the woods and a donor is going to not love an email that you send. And so needing tools that help enable you to modify, change, adapt your brain to the environment in which you're operating and want to be effective in is really normal. And everybody needs that. And so it is like, I want people to feel a sense of like sort of ownership over their own enablement too, and recognize that, yes, the title of the book is Enabling, and Embracing the People Behind the Purpose, because I also want the system and the systems players to recognize the need for this. But for the individual fundraiser, listening to this, you can enable yourself too. And so I just want to make sure we sort of leave that note for folks.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, I know it's not something that I've written, but just because you can doesn't mean you should. So I think it's really like important to be able to look at all the things that you can do. And it's like, yeah, you're great. Congratulations. You can do all those things. But at the end of the day, like that is a path to burnout, right? It was like trying to do all those things. Nobody can do it all. So I'm glad that I enabled you. This has been so much fun. But before we go, I just got to tell you one more thing. I love you.
I love you too.
This was
Bye,
fun.
guys.
Bye.